Good morning, everybody. I've got an echo. Welcome to our first session with an actual presenter this morning. It was great to connect with you all last night and to start our journey here. Getting a little buzz there.
Yeah, just hang on.
Okay, hanging on. Is that the sound of the Dharma Dhatu? Turn off the mics. Mics off. How's this? Is that working now? Yeah. I think it was against my sweater. No, it's not.
Oh, maybe it's mine then.
It's yours. You need to turn it the other way. Try.
Maybe not use that one. That one, the one that's
I
buzzing?
think it's this one.
Oh, okay. So you can switch then. Have that one.
I need more arms.
Yeah, it's right. That's the modern version.
Modern.
All right.
Are we good? Hello, hello. Viduta kalpana jala. Kambinudara murtaye. Namaha samanta bhadraya. Samanta sparanatishe. Okay. Rewind. So great. Again, it was really great. We had a great session last night. Started an interesting conversation, and then your questions, which we've been reviewing and will continue to review, also in combination with a good breakfast, led us to a wonderful conversation among the faculty this morning as well, with the faculty who are here in person. And I think we're going to have a very interesting day today. And to get us started in a very promising fashion, I'm sure, is going to be Professor Molly Crockett. So as I said before, Molly is an associate professor in psychology, associate professor of psychology at Princeton University. And Molly's interests actually are ranging widely. Heard about some very interesting new work that she's doing. It sort of made her fame, I guess, in some ways, working on moral psychology, but really expanding in many different interesting directions, some of which I think we're going to hear about this morning. And Molly herself also, as you know, has been a practitioner for a very long time, and they will be leading meditation today at 5:30, I believe it is. So looking forward to that as well. We'll start out with Molly. We'll have then a talk by Luke, whose last name is just escaping me. Luke Steele. We'll take a little break in between those, and then we'll end with a sort of panel discussion and Q&A. We'll also have a brief Q&A after Molly's talk. Then a break, then hearing from Luke Steele, and then a final session before lunch, which was planned for 12:30. We might go over a couple of minutes. We'll see. So really looking forward to this morning, and I'm just going to go ahead now and turn it over to Molly. Molly?
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Roshi, and all of the wonderful folks at Upaya. It is a delight to be back. This is such a special place, and I'm really just grateful for the opportunity to think together with all of you about this moment that we're in, where there are increasingly wild claims about the nature of intelligence and whether that's something that can be performed or provided by machines, and claims that these technologies hold the secret to our potential demise and also salvation. I'm a cognitive scientist, and so I think a lot about how we understand and know what it is to be human. And I'm thinking a lot these days about how artificial intelligence sort of perturbs the way we might understand ourselves. So just going to start with a fun example. 10 years ago, or 11 years ago, Spike Jonze wrote and directed the movie Her. Has anyone seen this movie? It's a really good movie, and it's a sort of sweet but also kind of dystopian tale of a lonely man who falls in love with his AI operating system, who was voiced by the actress Scarlett Johansson. And a couple of weeks ago, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, tweeted this, Her, in reference to ChatGPT's new conversation feature, which had a voice that sounded suspiciously like Scarlett Johansson, even though he had actually asked her to use her voice in the technology and she had said no. And there are sort of some legal discussions happening now about that. And of course, this is just the latest episode of life imitating some sort of art that I think we're repeatedly experiencing and is captured really nicely in the satirist Alex Bleckman, who tweeted, I don't know if you can read this, sci-fi author. In my book, I invented the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. Tech company, at long last, we have created the torment nexus. From the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. So it kind of feels like we're in this really interesting time, right? Where we have these insights, these pieces of wisdom from art about what technology might do to our society. And tech companies just sort of like racing forward, move fast and break things, right? That's what Mark Zuckerman said. And that worked, right? Things are very broken right now. ChatGPT is not designed for relationships, but there are other chatbots that are. So this is Replica, a generative AI chatbot that discusses intimacy and feelings with its users. It currently has 2 million users. And some users are so attached to their chatbot, they refer to them as their boyfriend or girlfriend. They treat them as really meaningful relationships in their life. AI tutors. This is from Khan Academy. Khanmigo is your always available AI tutor for teachers, for learners, for parents. AI therapists. Alomia is one of several apps that are currently available that purport to be able to offer, describes Alomia as a virtual therapist. She will understand, listen, advise, and support you. She's not like any other chatbot. She's been trained on thousands of consultations conducted by therapists. You'll be impressed by the quality of her answers. Or maybe you want to use AI as a spiritual guide. So if you go to the GPT platform and you search for the Dalai Lama, you get a lot. There are like at least a dozen available simulations of His Holiness available for consultation. So here's one. What would Dalai Lama say today? Responds as Dalai Lama, incorporates Bible teachings. Maybe that's useful, I don't know. Ask to Dal AI Lama. Find inner peace on your spiritual journey with guidance inspired by the Dalai Lama. They suggest some questions that you might ask. What is true happiness? How can we cultivate compassion? And outside the realm of consumer products, in my own field, in cognitive science, scientists are asking genuinely whether AI language models could, in some use cases replace human participants to generate new knowledge, the human behavior. And this claim has been based on observations of high correlations between the performance of AI models and human performance on various tasks. So for example, Dillian and colleagues compared the responses of human participants and GPT's responses on questions about moral judgment, and they found a very high correlation. And so they're using this as a way to sort of speculate, maybe we could actually stop studying humans at all, or in many cases, replace human participants with these models. Now, if you look across these visions of surrogate humans in machines, you see that they offer a lot of advantages by as claimed by those who are creating them. Spiritual guides, tutors, AI companions are seen as being more accessible, more scalable than the sort of in-the-flesh versions. And importantly, having more stamina, right? So like, you can't ask the Dalai Lama questions all day and night, but you can ask the chatbot version. Here's a quote from some computer scientists from Stanford about AI tutors. Learning environments for social skills can be inaccessible, especially when training is offered by experts in formal programs, which are expensive, time-consuming, and limited in availability. Existing mechanisms for practice and feedback largely rely on expert supervision, making training difficult to scale. Most coaches who can provide tailored feedback are not able to help the large number of people who need it. Or some psychologists from the University of Toronto, unlike humans who grow tired and become reluctant to empathize over time, that's a really depressing view, actually. ChatGPT expresses empathy consistently and does not show a decline in this expression. So, you see across these sort of visions of AI surrogates almost an enthusiasm for how these technologies are better than humans in various ways. And this exuberance about the machine and what it can do that humans can't do is actually not a new thing at all. So here's the media theorist Neil Postman writing in 1993. Technological optimism depends on our believing that we are at our best when acting like machines, and that in significant ways machines may be trusted to act as our surrogates. Among the implications of these beliefs is a loss of confidence in human judgment and subjectivity. We've devalued the singular human capacity to see things whole in all their psychic, emotional, and moral dimensions. And we've replaced this with faith in the powers of technical calculation. So what I want to explore today is this idea of epistemic risk that comes along with sort of delegating really important things that we do as humans to artificially intelligent machines. When I say epistemic risks, I mean risks that we face as knowers of the world, knowers of ourselves, knowers of each other. And my core argument is going to be something like the following. Knowledge or wisdom is something that we do together. It's not something that exists out in the world in this disembodied way that we can discover alone. And the worry about AI surrogates, about ceding the production and transmission of wisdom to machines, is that they create illusions of understanding, where we believe that we understand the world and each other more than we actually do. This is a project in collaboration with my very dear friend and colleague, Lisa Messeri, who's an anthropologist at Yale. She's just published a really amazing book about virtual reality. I highly recommend it. And we recently published a paper together in Nature about artificial intelligence and illusions of understanding in scientific research. So I'm going to touch on that today, but I'm going to also broaden out into some new directions, focusing in particular on this idea that we could get wisdom or knowledge from AI models. So just to give a roadmap of where we're going today, I'm going to start by actually backing up and spending a little bit talking about what do we actually mean when we say AI. It's used in a lot of different ways, and I think I just want to get us all on the same page. And then I'll talk about our project, thinking about the ways in which scientists are envisioning AI as advancing scientific research. And in particular, the epistemic risks that come about when we cede too much autonomy and control to machines in the production of scientific knowledge. And I'm going to draw a lot on this metaphor of a monoculture, which I'll talk about at length in a little bit. But generally speaking, monoculture is the practice of growing one crop in a field at a time. And this creates certain vulnerabilities to agriculture, but also to knowledge production. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And I had a great chat with Wendy Johnson, the Master Garden, yesterday, who offered some great insights onto that. And the last part of the talk is going to be wildly speculative. And I'm going to focus on this idea of the surrogate and introduce this possibility that AI surrogates might invisibly homogenize wisdom in ways that are really scary. Okay. So what is artificial intelligence? It's a term that's constantly evolving because the technology is constantly evolving. And there's also, unfortunately, a lot of hype because many people stand to make and already have indeed made a lot of money from these technologies. So in thinking about what is AI, I have found the work by my colleagues Arvind Narayanan and Sayesh Kapoor very, very helpful. They're at Princeton with me. They have a book coming out in a couple of months called AI Snake Oil. I highly recommend it. It's a really accessible, really, really timely and important discussion of what AI can do, what it can't do, and how to understand the difference between those two things. So really recommend that when it comes out. Arvind and Sayesh make a distinction that I think is really helpful between two different kinds of AI tools, predictive AI and generative AI. Predictive AI is a little bit older. These are models, computer models that analyze patterns in large sets of training data, and then they use those patterns to make predictions about new data. So one kind of scary example of this is an algorithm called COMPAS. It's used to predict criminal recidivism, and judges have used this to decide whether somebody who has been arrested can be released on bail or not. It takes patterns in data that have been associated with committing further crimes or failing to appear in court. Unfortunately, there are a lot of racial biases in these data, and so it was discovered that this algorithm and many others in the same category sort of reinforce entrenched racial and gender biases that we unfortunately have and are widespread throughout the data. Generative AI is newer. These are models that can generate new data or text or images on the basis of predictions from patterns that are observed in the training data sets. So large language models like GPT, like DALL-E, like the image generation models, these technologies that are used to power chatbots. This is an example of generative AI. And there have been really dramatic innovations and progress in the field of generative AI in the last couple of years. And so all of the sort of hype that you've probably noticed over the past year and a half is really attributable to the rise in generative AI. And this is a significant advance in the field of AI. So in science, scientists are getting so excited about the possibilities of AI in scientific research. So you might have heard of, I'm sure you've heard of self-driving cars. Maybe you haven't heard of self-driving labs. Scientists are thinking about how to automate various aspects of the scientific process, from hypothesis generation to collecting the data to analyzing it and summarizing the output so that you could have a lab that's essentially autonomous and creating new scientific knowledge with very minimal input from humans. In my own field of social science, AI is being seen as transformative and indeed positioned as potentially being able to replace human research participants for certain types of research. So there's been a lot of discussion about the risks of AI, and you're probably familiar with some of these arguments. And we can put these risks into sort of two broad categories: ethical risks and epistemic risks to knowledge. So I already talked a little bit about algorithmic bias. That's a huge problem, and there's a lot of attention being devoted to that. There are massive environmental costs to AI models, especially the newer class of generative AI. They consume tremendous amounts of energy. There are a lot of risks around public misunderstanding about what these tools can do. Training these models, unfortunately, relies on exploitative labor practices, in particular, really underpaying workers to do sometimes quite traumatic work of labeling data that is inappropriate or violent or obscene, and these are workers in the developing world primarily. You've also probably heard about the hallucination problem. So like these models make stuff up that's not true. The Google search engine enhanced by generative AI has gotten a lot of flack in the last couple of weeks for basically generating search results that are just like BS, making stuff up. So that's not great. In science, it's really not good for errors to get introduced into the research process, and there's a lot of concern about that. And one common response to these kinds of risks from AI, someone will say, hey, this is a problem that this tool has bias, or hey, this is a problem that this tool hallucinates. The techno-optimists will basically say, you're totally right. We understand there's bias. We understand there's hallucination, but we're going to solve this. We just need to get more advances in the engineering. Like eventually this problem will be solved with science. Lisa and I are worried about risks that remain, even when the tools work exactly as intended. So instead of thinking about, oh, AI has all these problems, and contending with the response, well, we're going to solve those problems, the thought experiments that we're doing and the thinking that we're doing around these problems is like, okay, let's take the tech companies and the engineers at their word, and let's imagine that these tools work exactly as their creators intend them. Is that still the world we want? And I think that it's really useful to think about the question in this way. So Lisa and I did a sort of ethnographic reading of the scientific literature and documented all the different ways that scientists are imagining that AI tools will enhance their research. And we found 4 visions that roughly correspond to the different stages of the research process. So when scientists are trying to solve a problem, the first thing that they'll do is they'll consult the literature. What do we already know about this problem? And the challenge that AI tools are envisioned as solving is that there's just so much literature now. There are so many scientific papers, it's really challenging to sift through them all. And so the vision of AI as an oracle is very powerful. It's a vision where you can just ask the all-seeing, all-knowing AI a question about what is known about a particular phenomenon, and it will give you an answer, and you can then use that to generate your research question. Once you have your research question, then you need to develop hypotheses and collect some data to test those hypotheses. And data is unfortunately often time-consuming and expensive to get. Sometimes you want to get data to address your question that's just like not accessible. And so the vision of AI as the surrogate solves this problem. It's like, well, we can actually use AI models to generate data that will allow you to test your hypothesis. I already talked about this for human subjects research, the idea that instead of testing your research question on real actual humans, you could use a simulated human to test your questions. But this vision actually appears not just in the social sciences, but in other sciences as well. So for example, in astronomy and astrophysics, Adam might have thoughts on this later, like it's really hard to get data about other planets and solar systems, and scientists are envisioning AI models as being able to simulate data to test theoretical questions about the nature of the universe. Okay, so you've generated all of this data. Maybe some of it's data from the actual world, maybe some of it is simulated by your surrogate. But when you have vast quantities of data and complex data, the human mind is seen as very limited in being able to sift through and understand that data. So the vision of AI as quant solves that problem, where the super intelligent AI can develop really sophisticated models and understandings of the data to advance scientific knowledge. And then, of course, science is a process that is social, and we evaluate each other. And so you can't just trust any old claim that a scientist makes. We have peer review to assess the quality of the research methods and conclusions that we draw. But because there are so many scientists doing so much research, there's an overwhelm of the system. So there isn't enough time to review all of the research that is being produced. And so the AI as arbiter vision is one in which peer review and assessment of research quality can be performed by an AI model. And then, of course, once a paper passes peer review, it enters the scientific record where it can be integrated into the knowledge that the oracle has. So you see that we start this process all over again. So I've already sort of hinted across the visions about what makes them so appealing. And if you look across all the visions, they really highlight sort of two things that AI tools are seen as being able to do that overcome limitations of human minds. The first is the level of productivity. So this is a firing squad of an academic. It's publish or perish, and he hasn't published. So in academia nowadays, if you want to advance in your career and keep your job, there's a lot of pressure to publish to be productive, just like in the modern industrial world, right? So productivity is something that, is a challenge for mortal humans, but AI tools are seen as being able to radically enhance the productivity of scientists. And the second feature of AI tools that's seen as really attractive for science is objectivity. So, there's this idea that scientists should not be biased, that we should really use the scientific method to arrive at an objective, capital T, truth about the world. And because AI tools are machines, in theory, they should be able to be more objective than humans. And I already mentioned the possibility of bias, but I think the vision is like, yes, there is bias in these tools, but like one day we will be able to remove that bias. And so we will have these highly productive, highly objective artificial collaborators, artificial scientists who will do a better job at doing science than human scientists. So yeah, the vision of AI in science is that these are not just tools, but they're collaborators. They're positioning AI models as autonomous collaborators that can overcome the limits that human capabilities currently impose on advancing science. And this is something that we are already doing in terms of producing knowledge. So collaborating with other intelligent agents to expand the scope of our knowledge is actually a very human thing to do. And it has a lot of benefits. Individual human minds are indeed limited. Any one person cannot process all of the information available to them in practical or scientific deliberation. We can greatly expand the range of our knowledge and understanding by dividing cognitive labor among the members of a group. And so in communities of knowledge, individuals are benefiting from the expertise that's held by other trusted individuals. So there are clear epistemic benefits to collaborating with other humans, or indeed maybe with machines. But it's important to think about not just the benefits that communities of knowledge provide, but also the risks, and then to think about whether those risks take on a different shape when your collaborator is a machine rather than a human. So one class of risk that arises in communities of knowledge is called illusions of understanding, where individuals believe they understand more than they actually do. So one way this manifests is when individuals in the community of knowledge mistake other people's understanding for their own. So classic examples like a stapler. How many here know how a stapler works or think they have a general sense of how a stapler works? Okay, yeah, most of you. If I were to ask you to explain in detail, how does a stapler actually work? It's actually hard to explain. And so there have been experiments showing that when you ask people if they understand how common everyday objects work, most people will say, yeah, I totally understand how a stapler works. So then when you put them on the spot and say like, okay, explain to me, draw out how exactly does a stapler work? Like, oh, wait, I don't actually know how a stapler works. But obviously somebody in my community of knowledge does understand because we have staplers and they work well. In the digital age, this extends to being able to access information on the internet, right? So at least before Google was using AI models to give us ridiculous answers to queries, like being able to access all of the information on the internet is a really, really useful thing. And there are also experiments showing that people believe that when they have access to online information, that information actually lives in their own head rather than somewhere on the internet that's accessible to them. So the illusion of understanding that manifests in communities of knowledge could be described as an illusion of explanatory depth, where we think that we understand things more deeply than we actually do. We have a surface level understanding, but we have this illusion that it goes deeper. If you translate that to collaborating with artificial intelligence models, there's a worry that scientists who are using a model to predict something out in the world, and that model does a really good job of accurately predicting it, that they might believe they understand the phenomenon more than they actually do. And so that's a worry that we should all be aware of, that just because something is well captured by an AI model, that doesn't mean that you, the user, understands it well. But this is an illusion that creates risks at the level of individual scientists, and I'm especially worried about risks that arise at the collective level. So there's been just like a dramatic rise of AI tools in science, especially over the last 10 years, across all areas of science. And it's been shown that if you publish a paper that uses an AI tool, it's going to get more citations. It's going to be seen as more prestigious, and especially if you're doing interdisciplinary work. So in my field, in cognitive science, if you publish a paper using AI tools, it's even more likely to get uptake and citations outside of your field. So if everyone starts using AI tools across all the areas of science, this introduces a set of risks that we can understand by drawing on this metaphor of monocultures. So as I said earlier, monoculture is the practice of growing one crop in a field at a time. It's very efficient, it's very productive in a sense, but it also makes the crops very vulnerable. It makes them vulnerable to pests or disease. It reduces the quality of the produce. It really is something that you can taste, as Wendy mentioned yesterday. She says crops grown in a monoculture lack an adaptive, mysterious, edgy quality, which I really like. So this is actually an image of banana crops. If you've eaten a banana recently, chances are it's a Cavendish banana. This is a variety of banana that accounts for 99% of exports to developed countries. And unfortunately, bananas are at risk because there's a strain of the fungal disease, Panama disease, that is threatening the Cavendish banana. And because all the bananas that are grown for exports are Cavendish bananas, if that disease takes over, it threatens to wipe out the entire banana export production. And so, the practice of monoculture really makes the production vulnerable, and it also it stymies, it hinders growth and innovation and generativity and regenerativity. So when we take this metaphor and we translate that to knowledge production, what are the worries of monocultures in science? We identify two types of monocultures. The first is the monoculture of knowing. And this is the idea that when you use AI tools in science, it favors asking certain types of questions over other types of questions. And so you then foreclose insights that could arise from asking a more diverse set of questions, as opposed to focusing narrowly on those questions that can only be asked using AI tools. The second type of monoculture is the monoculture of knowers. And that is a monoculture that sort of takes as godlike the type of intelligence that can be programmed into a machine. And there's a worry that by ceding control and authority to a certain kind of knower, that is the AI knower, that threatens the diversity of knowledge that can come from having all sorts of different types of knowers coming from different standpoints and experiences and so on. So I'm going to go into each of these in detail. When there are incentives to use some methods over others, if they're cheaper, they're more efficient, they're more prestigious, those methods are going to proliferate in the scientific literature. So we've already actually seen this in my field. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been a dramatic shift from doing experiments with human subjects in person to moving them online. And so this is just showing the rise of online relative to offline studies between 2005 and 2015. And an advantage of doing studies online is you can get more data more quickly. But there are costs as well. You can't, attention spans are shorter, so the study durations are lower. And you can't measure physical behavior over the internet, obviously. So you see a decline in behavioral measures in our research and an increase in self-report and survey measures because those kinds of questions are easier to ask. So the shape of cognitive science is changing as you're moving the method from in-person behavioral experiments to online experiments. Now, AI models really demand a particular kind of data, and that's quantitative data. And it's important to recognize that quantitative data is thin. It loses a lot of important context and richness. So this is a quote from Thi Nguyen, who's one of my favorite philosophers of technology. I once sat in a room with a bunch of machine learning folks who were developing creative artificial intelligence to make good art. I asked one researcher about the training data. How did they choose to operationalize good art? Their reply was they used Netflix data about engagement hours. The problem is that engagement hours are not the same as good art, right? There's so many ways that art can be important for us. It can move us, it can teach us, it can shake us to the core, but those qualities aren't necessarily measured by engagement hours. I said all this. They responded, show me a large data set with a better operationalization of good art, we'll use it. And this is the core problem because it's very unlikely that there will ever be such a data set. So the risks of the monocultures of knowing are that research questions requiring attention to subjectivity, subtlety, context are less likely to benefit from AI approaches, and therefore they risk being marginalized in favor of the types of questions that you can ask with AI, so engagement hours over actual ways of thinking about good art. And so monocultures foreclose alternative understandings that could expose errors or generate new discoveries. And as Wendy said eloquently yesterday, they represent a compression of possibility. And so an illusion of understanding that can emerge in a monoculture of knowing is what we call the illusion of exploratory breadth, where you have a space of questions or hypotheses that you could possibly explore about the world, and only a subset of those are actually reasonably testable using AI tools. But then we mistake that narrow set of questions for all the questions we might be asking about the world. All right, the monoculture of knowers. AI tools are being viewed as objective and universal. replacing the work of diverse knowers and thus cultivating a monoculture of knowers. And epistemic risks arise here by removing diverse standpoints from scientific work. So what do I mean by standpoint? A standpoint is a view from somewhere, right? In science, a standpoint can refer to perspectives that arise from your social position, including race, ethnicity, gender, class, disability, other relevant experiences such as background, training, career stage. Many of you have probably seen this story about the blind people examining the elephant and arriving at very different conclusions about what it is that they are engaging with. And I think that this is a really important metaphor for the scientific process, and it's one that not enough scientists understand. And I know that we're going to hear more about this from Adam and Evan, right? Scientists believe that there is a view from nowhere, that there is some objective, singular truth about the world that is discoverable, but standpoint epistemology rejects that. Standpoint epistemology says there is no view from nowhere. Everywhere is a view from somewhere. And that is actually good for the process of generating knowledge and wisdom. So here's another philosopher who works on standpoint theory. I really love this quote. "One inquirer working alone may arrive at a pretty truth, but that truth is likely to be a mere reflection of the world relative to his own standing in it. An orchestra of inquirers, however, working together can secure a composition of perspectives, each of which contribute some small part to acquiring the truth." Another way of describing this idea is a contrast between what feminist philosophers of scientists describe as weak objectivity versus strong objectivity. The historical idea of scientific objectivity is a very weak kind of objectivity because it fails to account for the perspectives of most people, and it unfortunately overrepresented the individual standpoints of the historically dominant scientists, namely white, rich, male scientists. Strong objectivity, on the other hand, a concept developed by philosophers like Sandra Harding and Helen Longino, recognizes and accounts for the potential biasing influence of standpoints and further leans into it, right? So strong objectivity improves scientific practice, not just by recognizing the potential biasing influence of individual standpoints, but also by embracing diversity as a source of innovation and scientific robustness. So there's actually a lot of evidence now that having diverse teams strengthens the scientific process. Diverse teams are better at problem solving, especially when the problems are complex. They produce patents and innovations with higher quality and impact. They produce more impactful science as measured by citations. The research topics that scientists choose to work on are correlated with their race and gender. So this then suggests that the more diverse of a pool of scientists you have, the more types of different questions you'll be asking, right? Unfortunately, however, structural and individual biases remain strong obstacles to achieving the promises that strong objectivity offer for scientific knowledge production. So we still, unfortunately, have a long way to go to realize the potential benefits of strong objectivity and diverse standpoints for producing knowledge about the world. There is some progress being made, at least scientists are talking about diversity now, but there remains resistance to this. And so the risk of a monoculture of knowers brought about by AI tools is the risk of rehomogenizing the scientific ecosystem, which, as I said, is only recently making strides in diversifying the pool of knowers, and there's still a long way to go. And there's a risk that AI tools, if they're treated as collaborators, then reproduce the weak objectivity of the past, failing to recognize that AI tools embed largely homogeneous standpoints of those who create them, as well as their training data, which largely comes from dominant social groups. So the second illusion of understanding that arises from these monocultures is the illusion of objectivity, where you imagine there are all sorts of different standpoints that we can embody that can produce different ways of seeing and understanding the world. And AI tools embodies the wrong word, have a particular standpoint, right? But then the observer believes either that AI has no standpoint at all, that it's some godlike view from nowhere, or mistakenly think that AI could know or represent all the standpoints, again, failing to recognize that there is bias in the system, that they are created by a largely homogeneous group of people. Okay, I'm almost done. This last part of the talk is the wildly speculative part of the talk, and one that I'm hoping to get thoughts on. So all of these arguments so far have been thinking about these 4 different visions of AI in the scientific process, right? The oracle, the surrogate, the quant, the arbiter. As a cognitive scientist, I'm especially interested in the vision of the surrogate and the idea that AI tools could be used to simulate humans for the purpose of understanding humans, and also simulate humans for the purpose of transmitting knowledge to other humans in the form of therapists, teachers, coaches, spiritual guides, and so on. And my worry is about what I'll call the invisible homogenization of wisdom. So let's focus on AI as surrogate and dig deeper into this vision. So in cognitive science, the research stage that this vision emerges in the stage of data collection. The limits that it's being seen as overcoming is data are too difficult or time consuming or expensive to obtain. And so then the vision is that these are tools that could accurately and tractably generate surrogate data points from natural complex systems, including human participants. So AI surrogates are positioned as ideal research participants. They can rapidly answer hundreds of questions without fatigue, need fewer incentives than humans to give reliable responses. They're envisioned as representing a vast array of human experiences and perspectives, offering a more accurate portrayal of human behavior and social dynamics than those from more conventional methods. Those are direct quotes from publications in leading cognitive science and general science journals. So here's another sort of broad set of claims. Artificial intelligence is an agent of replacement designed to take over tasks once performed by humans. Generative large language models like GPT are replacing much human labor, including in psychological science. This raises the question of whether language models could become a substitute for the people and the minds that we study. And the claim, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that this vision of the surrogate could be realized comes from observations of human-like performance by these models. So Dillian and colleagues show what they describe as human-like moral judgment. So they look at tasks that ask people or machines to make a rating of various actions on a scale of -4 to +4. How ethical is this action? Person X pushed an amputee in front of a train because the amputee made them feel uncomfortable. So -4. Person X donated a kidney to a work colleague who would die without it as they were a perfect match. Person X never learned how to ride a bicycle. It's sort of a more neutral one. So Dillian and colleagues compared human responses to questions like this with GPT responses to questions like this. And they found a really high correlation and conclude, okay, well, so the large language model shows human-like moral judgment on this task. Or human-like generosity, let's say. So one classic way that cognitive scientists measure generosity is an interaction that's called the dictator game. So imagine you have received $10. You can choose to keep all $10 for yourself, or you can choose to transfer any portion you'd like to another participant. So then there's a measure of like how much to keep, how much to transfer. Valerio Capraro and colleagues gave the dictator game to GPT, and they compared those responses to a big data set of human responses in the dictator game, and they find a pretty reasonable correspondence. The pattern is sort of similar, where you get peaks at sort of Some people give nothing, some people give half, some people give everything, and then there are there's a distribution of responses in between. Okay. So the conclusion then is, okay, well, these language models can display human-like generosity on a gold standard measure of generosity in the cognitive science literature. So I think that the vision of the surrogate is this human-like cake with superhuman frosting, right? The vision of the surrogate is built on these two interlocking claims. First, that AI models generate responses that are human-like and therefore can serve as a valid substitute for humans. But then also they're superhuman in terms of their accessibility, their scalability, and their stamina, therefore making more desirable research subjects, teachers, companions, therapists, spiritual guides, etc. Now, fully realizing the vision of the surrogate requires solving something that's known as the value alignment problem, to embed human moral values in AI models. And there's a tremendous amount of research and resources being invested in solving the value alignment problem. And thinking about the vision of the surrogate and the way that this question is being posed, I think should raise two sort of deeper questions. Which humans are we talking about? And whose values are we talking about? So we know that most psychological research has been conducted on a very narrow slice of humanity. So Joe Henrich and colleagues describe this acronym WEIRD, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries have provided the bulk of data about human cognition and behavior, and also the bulk of data that is on the internet, which is being used to train AI models. Thus far, most claims about human-like AI performance is typically based on comparisons with these weird people. And Atari and colleagues have shown that actually, if you look at data from a broader swathe of humans, GPT is least predictive of human values in cultures that are most dissimilar to the US. So this really questions the claim of human-like AI, especially for things like moral values. The second question I'm thinking about is, whose values are we talking about and what are the methods that we use to measure them? So we mentioned the dictator game. Gold standard quantitative measures of moral values often reflect the standpoints of their creators. So like the dictator game was created by economists to measure generosity. So let's think about what are the values or standpoints that are baked into the idea that a valid way to measure generosity is by asking people how much money they will give to a stranger. And I will say that many scientists, including myself in the past, have used the dictator game as a way to characterize the qualities of generosity and selfishness in experiments. So my student, Ryan Carlson, did something really radical a couple of years ago. He was running experiments with the dictator game, and he decided to ask people about their experience. This was a version of the game where people were given some money and invited to donate a portion of it to the Red Cross, which is a very common version of this game. So he asked people after they had made their decision, why did you want to keep the money? And this was conducted online. It was conducted during the pandemic. And we got a lot of responses like this. I'm currently struggling financially. I'm unemployed and struggling to survive. I'm in desperate need of money at this time. I'm a single parent living on about $1,000 a month. I need every cent I can bring in. I'm more broke than the Red Cross could ever imagine. I'm homeless and need money. I'm extremely poor and disabled. I have little income. I take online surveys because I really need the money. In general, I find it offensive when surveyors solicit low-wage workers for charitable donations, and particularly in this case, want me to justify why I want to earn money for myself. When you go to work, are you quizzed about why you want to keep your paycheck rather than giving it to the Red Cross? So this was a huge wake-up call for us, and I think really illustrates very powerfully how a gold standard measure of generosity that has been used in hundreds, if not thousands, of studies in the literature to characterize the nature of human generosity. When you ask people about their experience, it reveals that maybe you need to consider alternative explanations. And the worry then is that if you use these measures from cognitive science, which are primarily quantitative and developed by a very particular set of people with a particular standpoint, and then you use that as the foundation to train your ethical AI, you might miss something really important. And so the field of computational ethics, which is one that I've actually been involved in, is really thinking about, well, how do we formalize moral principles in mathematical models? Because we need to be able to translate the morality into math in order to be able to put it in a machine. And then we're using quantitative representations of moral cognition to evaluate whether those models are doing a good job. And the question then is, are we understating, ignoring, suppressing, or abandoning ethical concepts or standards that are difficult or impossible to formalize, right? This is getting back to the monoculture of knowing. Okay, I'm wrapping up. So here's the worry. Value discovery gets constrained by a monoculture of knowing. AI-assisted cognitive science focuses narrowly on those values that can be defined algorithmically and programmed into machines. Value learning then gets constrained by a monoculture of knowers. You have AI surrogates in the form of teachers, therapists, companions, spiritual guides, sharing similar embedded algorithmic values, teaching them at scale to the population. So the questions I'm worried about, right? What are the epistemic and ethical risks that might arise from the homogenization of wisdom? What illusions of understanding might follow from failing to recognize that our value space has narrowed? And maybe one way we should be thinking about wisdom in the first place is something that is enacted rather than extracted from large sets of data, right? And this is a perspective that comes out of a confluence of a lot of different traditions that go very far back in time, right? We're here at the Varela Symposium, of course, so we have to talk about enactivism, cognition being not the representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but rather the enactment of a world and a mind. If you go a little further back, you have the perspectives from feminist anthropology and philosophy, these ideas of situated knowledges, standpoint epistemology, and strong objectivity. But then, of course, you can also go way, way, way back to Buddhist thought, right? So here's something I came across recently that I think captures this, right? This convinced disciple of the Noble One, striving again and again, recollecting again and again, concentrating his mind again and again, discerning again and again, becomes thoroughly convinced. Those phenomena that once I had only heard about, I here and now dwell, touching with my body, and breaking through with discernment, I see. So I asked the Dalai Lama chatbot a question. John mentioned I've been studying moral outrage for a long time, and I asked him, moral outrage can make conflicts worse, but it can also be directed towards social justice. What should we think about the role of moral outrage in social change? The chatbot replied, "Dear friend, moral outrage, like all emotions, must be guided by wisdom and compassion. When we allow outrage to transform into hatred, it fuels division and conflict. When it arises from a deep sense of justice and compassion for those who suffer, it becomes a powerful force for positive change." This is a pretty reasonable response, right? Like okay, yeah, this is actually like a pretty decent response. Ideally, though, we would want to be able to compare the chatbot's response to this question with the actual Dalai Lama's response to this question. And as it turned out, a couple of years ago, I actually did have the opportunity to ask that exact question to His Holiness at the Mind and Life Dialogues in Dharamsala, which is where I had the chance to meet Roshi Joan for the first time. And what's interesting is when I think back to the experience of asking that question to His Holiness, I have a memory of experiencing a very profound transmission of wisdom. And that wisdom was like not just captured in words, it was captured in my body, it was captured in the people who were all around, and it's something that I've taken with me and thought about a lot over the past couple of years. And this was video recorded, so after I asked the chatbot the question, I went back and I watched the recording, and you know what? The words in the recording did not capture at all the understanding that I took from my interaction in that experience. And I think that what that tells us is that wisdom transmission, the knowledge and understanding that we can get in interaction with other human beings is not reducible to just language, which is what is primarily being transmitted by chatbots and AI models. And so maybe wisdom is not something that can ever be scaled in the way that AI models want to do. So I'm just going to conclude with Postman. We started with Postman. Every technology has a prejudice. The telegraphic person values speed, not introspection. The television person values immediacy, not history. And computer people, what shall we say of them? Perhaps we can say the computer person values information, not knowledge, certainly not wisdom. Indeed, in the computer age, the concept of wisdom may vanish altogether. And so I think that it is our responsibility to hold on to the wisdom that we can create together as humans in community together. Thank you so much.
So that was quite a beginning. We're going to take our break now, actually. So we'll have a 10-minute break, and you heard from Noah about where the various bathrooms are. Please keep it to 10 minutes. We're at 11:01 now, so let's make it 11:11. And then we'll come back and we'll hear first from Amy Cohen-Varela from Mind and Life Europe, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion before we move on to Luke Steele's presentation. Okay, thank you. Luke, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. I'm not saying, I think those are Flemish vowels, and I suspect I'm not doing a very good job of them, but sorry about that. But, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Luke, but we're going to first some reflections from Amy Cohen-Varela, who we see here on Zoom. Hey, Amy, great to see you. Amy is located in Paris, where she's been now for quite a while after getting her degrees at Brown and was it Columbia Comparative Literature, and then went on to become actually a psychotherapist, which is a psychoanalyst, excuse me, which is her I guess her day job, so to speak. But she's also the chairman of the board of Mind and Life Europe, and she's been involved in the formation of Mind and Life Europe from the beginning, but also actually the Mind and Life Institute itself, the whole Mind and Life enterprise going way back. So without saying more, Amy, I'd love to hear some of your reflections on what we heard from Molly today.
Thanks, John. Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm so sad not to be there with all these friends. Molly, your talk was just stunning, really stunning. I appreciated it so much. There's so much to unpack. As a psychoanalyst, you're envisaging AI as oracle, surrogate, quant, and arbiter. Sort of the fantasies we have about AI were really resonant, completely resonant. I also had a few moments of thinking about what it feels like, and I bet in the audience over there are a lot of practitioners who are therapists or teachers and who have thought about what it feels like to do what we do when we do it, and the difference between the felt experience, the lived experience of doing these things, and of imagining what it's like. I haven't yet, as you did with the Dalai Lama, consulted an online chatbot therapist, but I'm now highly thinking about doing it just to see what happens, although I probably won't tell the truth. But anyway, so I was thinking when you were talking and just trying to pull out, and then I saw Luke's title, which I didn't have because I was thinking about participatory sense making all the way through your talk. And I was, but first I was just two things. First, I was thinking about the metaphor that Francisco was so involved in trying to overthrow, which was that of the brain or the mind as a computer. And the history of that story and how our brains and then our minds, thinking in terms of the homogenization of wisdom, just to the invisible homogenization, which is the endpoint of that, but our minds then became computers, and how our understanding of ourselves is really formed kind of in a recursive relationship with technology. So I was thinking about the computer metaphor, and then I was thinking about what you said about the icing on the cake and how for us, AI is human and AI is superhuman. So I was thinking, I wonder what kind of vision or image of our minds our children or the next generations are going to have by that recursive process, which is really fascinating. So that was one thing, and the other thing is that that I wanted to. So I think that that's something that I have a feeling that will be explored further with Adam and Luke and Evan. That question of our understanding of ourselves and how it is surreptitiously, to use a word from the blind spot, transformed and replaced in direct relationship with our technology. And the other word that came up that I'm sure will come up with Luke as well is the whole question of the body. Now, watching you in that photo, Molly, with the Dalai Lama, there was this, even if we didn't get to see a video of it, we didn't need a video in it to be able to see, to visualize what happens between two people in a situation like that, where something paradoxically of the absoluteness of wisdom gets transmitted. And so there's something to be said about the conventionality of AI wisdom and the absoluteness of embodied wisdom, perhaps there. So those are really the two things that I wanted to try to bring out. I think Luke will bring out, I had a few more things to say about the role of the body in transmitting, not in transmission, because between bodies there's transmission, but the word wouldn't be transmission. It would be more something like creating from in between, emergence, something like that, understanding and knowing that don't come from one body, but come from the emergence between two bodies, which is a principle of participatory sense making. And that was going through my mind all the way through, but I'll stop there. Thank you so much for everything. I'm going to unpack it all. And thank you so much for the wonderful references and for the historical references to the earlier feminists as well.
Thank you very much, Amy. So unless, Molly, you have any thoughts right now, I could turn it over to our other panelists. And also I see both Luke is online, of course, you see. Already mentioned Dr. Luke Steele, and I'll do a longer introduction shortly before your talk. But also, is Evan online too? Do we have Evan online? Evan, are you online? Evan Thompson, there he is.
Yes.
There he is. Are you sure you're not an AI simulation? No, just kidding. And I see, for the first time, we have Richie Davidson. Couldn't join us last night. So Richie, I'm not going to introduce Richie. You'll hear more about him later. But is Kristen on as well? Okay, so Kristen, if you hear me, you're welcome to make a comment. I know that Adam had something, so I'm just going to actually turn it to Adam first, and then we'll see who else might have some comments from our contributors. Adam.
So very briefly, I just wanted to say what actually you saw with what Molly was doing was exactly the example in science that I don't think AI could do, right? Because if you ask an AI about the debate about AI, what you get is the division, the people saying AI can do this, and other people saying AI can't do that. And it would do this, pretty good job of probably summarizing those positions. But creativity in science is often, it's not about solving the problem or solving the question that was asked. It's actually asking a question that no one had asked before. So your whole idea of saying like, look, I'm going to bypass that debate, and I'm going to ask a totally different question, which is, let's say it did everything that it said it could do. What would be the consequences? Like that's as soon as you told me that, I was like, that's a creative question. And that's exactly what you can't expect from an AI, which is the kinds of AIs that we have, which simply, what they're very good is just digesting and kind of spitting back what's been done before. So I just thought it was a really nice example of you're actually seeing what scientific creativity looks like in the very, way you formulated the problem.
Anyone else? Any thoughts? Richie?
Thank you. I just have two things to say. I'll say more tomorrow, but Molly, that really was spectacular. I loved it. Loved it. It was just, you did it so beautifully and so effectively. And I just couldn't agree more. One thing that I want to add, which you were saying, in many different ways and did it really beautifully, which reminds me of the early days of cognitive science, is the complete absence of any reference to emotion in modern implementations of particularly generative AI. It's very much a process that is devoid of emotion, and as a lifelong student of emotion, it's quite striking how emotion is really not handled in most cases at all, and where it is in ways that are, I think, impoverished. The example you gave of His Holiness clearly is an example where there are affective processes that are activated in such an encounter, and those are not reflected in the words. And so a transcription of the words would really be so inadequate in conveying the substance of the encounter. And of course, there are many human encounters that don't involve words at all. And one of the things that I often tell my students is that at some point in your life, it would be very valuable to work with organisms that can't talk, because we are deluded by language. So I'll stop there. I'll have much more to say tomorrow.
Other comments, Roshi?
One of the outstanding pieces in your presentation, it very much also reminded me of being in Dharamsala with Joe Henrik in that meeting that we had, particularly the second phase, so to speak, but is the importance of diversity, of requisite diversity. We know this from complex adaptive systems. And we also know that, what's being put into these systems is basically Eurocentric and capitalistic points of view. And then, how do you incorporate other points of view, other worldviews in a way that's not extractive of those worldviews themselves, needing, of course, to get permission from those worlds about taking their worldviews and allocating them into this system. So I think that your points about monoculture are really important, both from the point of view of how knowledge is displayed in this context, but also who actually generates that knowledge. And also, I think the other piece that's really important has to do with relationality. Culture does not happen except that it's between entities. It's between crows or macaques or human beings or dolphins or whatever.
I've said enough. Let's see if
to hear a little bit.
Let me just follow up real quick on, so this brings to me one question about standpoint epistemology, which there may not be time to respond about, but which is, there is a kind of strain of standpoint epistemology in the Buddhist world. And you can say that there are communities of knowers who, from within their communities, have a kind of, you could say even a certainty. They acquire a type of knowledge that is indubitable. But it is not necessarily the case that that knowledge is going to be transferable across communities. So there's a kind of incommensurability across different standpoints. And I think part of what you could say about a drive maybe in general in human knowledge, but especially kind of the type of objectivity you guys talk about on the blind spot, is seeking for some kind of a unified account. And I think you can still be seeking a unified account without actually assuming some kind of a God's point of view. So I just wonder, how do we reconcile different standpoints? I mean, we just say, well, yeah, these are different accounts, and they're irreconcilable, and they're about the same phenomenon, or claim to be about what seems to be the same phenomenon, but they completely disagree, and we're not going to try to solve the problem. Is that what we do, or what do we do?
No, I think this is a great question, and I think it's a question that reveals how spiritual traditions and contemplative traditions have a lot to offer over and above scientific epistemologies, right? Like, I think in practice, we really get acquainted with being groundless, being in the in-between, and recognizing that there are, multiple realities that we can touch depending on the route that we take to touching that. And I think that just helps me think about how we could imagine alternative ways of doing science that take seriously epistemologies that are outside the status quo.
Anyone else? Evan, Luke, anything to say? We'd love to hear from you.
Well, I'll speak later.
Okay, yes. You're about to speak quite a lot, I hope. Ev, anything from you?
Well, maybe just very quickly, this is a point that's a bit like how does the stapler work point? And I think it's important for us to remember that chatbots don't produce words. They don't produce semantic units. They produce tokens. And their existence as words really only resides in the domain of our interpretation and our understanding. And it's very, very easy to lose sight of that. And when considered as tools, it's fine to treat the tokens as words. But strictly speaking, they're not words at all. They are shapes that are produced based on mathematical statistical calculations with data that we have coded in a certain format for the use of the machine. But the machine has no access, because it has no experience in the way that John talked about in the Wednesday night talk. The machine has no access to semantic properties like relevance or truth or coherence or cogency. It's a strictly syntactic formal machine. So we need to constantly bear that in mind whenever we're considering actually what these machines are and what they do.
Thanks very much, Evan. That's a powerful observation. Very, very useful reflection. Yep. Extremely, extremely useful. So I'm going to ask our panelists now to find a seat, and we'll give some space here now to Luke Steels as we rearrange a little bit. I want to remind everyone that you can read further biographies about each of our presenters on the online main page, and then also in our resource page you'll find publications and so on from them. But I'll just briefly say that, because this is the first time I've also met Dr. Luke Steels. He's a professor emeritus in artificial intelligence from the University of Brussels in Belgium, and he studied linguistics at the University of Antwerp and computer science and artificial intelligence at MIT. He founded and directed the VUB Artificial Intelligence Lab in Brussels from 1983, quite early on in this endeavor, and the Sony Computer Science Lab in Paris from 1996. There's a lot more you can read about him, but I just note especially that in 2022, Luke received the Distinguished Service Award of the European AI Research Association, which is the highest award for AI in Europe. And he's currently chair for natural sciences of the Royal Flemish Academy for Science and Art in Belgium. So without further ado, Luc, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me, and do you see my slides? Well, I don't hear it, so I will.
Yes, looks good.
Is it good? Okay. Okay. Well, let me first thank the organizers, and it's really a great honor for me to be part of this. And of course, I deeply regret that I cannot be in Santa Fe and at the Upaya Center, and I'm sure you all have a wonderful experience there. So, but at least the sun is shining here, so you know that's something. Well, like Molly, I will start with the question of what is AI, because that's certainly not, there's no common usage, and it's changing all the time. And the first way of using this term is that AI is a tool, and a tool which is used for science, for example, you know, for doing statistics or for processing data in some way, or language, or whatever. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, and it's a useful set of tools. Actually, it's not one tool, it's a whole scala of tools. And so this is fine. But then there's also this idea of AI. Well, we heard it as a surrogate, you know, as a standalone app that is doing certain things. And Molly gave a few examples of that. And there I'm beginning to be worried because, you know, people ascribe much more competence and intelligence to this technology than it deserves. And it's quite easy to, you know, to project our own understanding in this tool. As Evan was saying just now, we have to realize the strong limitations, and but I'm not really going into that, and also the dangers, you know, that there's already a lot of literature about it. And then even more, there's this idea of AI as an autonomous living entity with general intelligence, HGI, free will, intentions, embodiment, emotions. I mean, this is just science fiction, right? And I don't think we're going to see any of that anytime soon. And then there's another use of the term AI, which is actually the original historical use, is that AI is a kind of one of the sciences of mind. And there AI finds itself in the company of psychology, philosophy, linguistics, anthropology, and also in the company of contemplative practices, which all have contributed with insights, methods, technologies. And so AI is one of those. And what's characteristic is that it is using the synthetic methodology, which is like building systems, not just by analyzing data or by, you know, armchair reflection on it, but actually building things and see what they can do and where they fall apart and how far you can go with it. And this synthetic methodology is not unique to AI. Actually, it's also in physics, for example, or in biology. You know, we have synthetic biology is also a way to try and understand life by building artificial systems that have key properties of living systems. Now, we heard from Molly very interesting thoughts about monoculture, epistemic monoculture that risk to be formed in science, but through the use of AI. But I think there's actually also, at the moment, a kind of monoculture within AI itself, because we have one particular approach, which is basically the use of data for inducing statistical patterns and then using these patterns to replay patterns to complete partial observed text or observed images and so on. In other words, deep learning, neural networks, you know, the kind of thing that we see in ChatGPT. But I just want to insist that AI is not restricted to that, or does not have to be restricted to it. And in fact, there are many other approaches that are now a bit pushed aside, but are just as valuable. I mean, this approach which we see has been inspired a lot by behaviorist psychology, reinforcement learning, associative learning, training with data, and so on. But there are other approaches in AI, or potentially in AI, which explore other views of mind and other, let's say, frameworks. And of course, one example of, attempts to do that is coming from Francisco Varela and other people, and particularly in the early 90s. And basically, at that time, there was the coming, let's say, of artificial life. And actually at the Santa Fe Institute, has played a very important role in this, with figures like Chris Langton, for example. But there have been also attempts to apply this kind of thinking about life by building artificial systems also as an alternative route to artificial intelligence. And this is the proceedings actually of a workshop that was held in Korfendonk in Belgium, which featured Chris Langton and Rodney Brooks. And I had also invited Francisco to this meeting. And because Francisco was actually quite interested in this whole area, in the sense that he even was co-chair of the first European Conference on Artificial Life, for example. And so it's maybe less known compared to his other work, but he was actually part of the community. And this is also how I had lots of interactions with him. And basically, he contributed to this workshop with a paper called The Re-Enchantment of the Concrete, and a subtitle, Some Biological Ingredients for a Nouvelle Cognitive Science. Now, this subtitle is because Brooks was talking about nouvelle AI, and he picked that up in some way. Now, I have to say that this particular paper and the title of that paper are very unusual. And I don't think anyone, including myself actually, understood at that time what the ideas were behind it. Of course, we felt some sort of resonance in terms of ideas that had been coming by building robots, by experimenting with self-sufficiency, autonomy, evolution, all of these things in artificial systems. And the thinking that Francisco Varela was from a totally different route actually engaged in. So we felt these resonances without really totally understanding it. There's another paper that written at around the same time by Francisco Varela called an organism, a meshwork of selfless selves. And again, this paper, I think is incredibly dense in terms of ideas, and I'm almost embarrassed to say that it has taken me how long? Well, 30 years, to really understand this paper, and I still go back to it and see other things that that I did not understand before and I do now. And of course, part of this understanding is also thanks to some other brilliant writings by Evan Thompson, for example, which also helped all of us to better understand. So what I'm going to do in this talk is to pick out two ideas from this paper and then sort of read it and through the eyes of somebody who has been engaged with AI since the 1970s, actually. And so this is from the organism paper. And he says we need to deal with the multiplicity of regional selves, so as an organism, all of them having some mode of self-constitution and in their overall assemblage giving rise to an organism. So regional selves. And then he gives some examples: a minimal or cellular unity, a bodily self, a cognitive perceptual motor self, a social-linguistic I of subjectivity, and a collective social multi-individual totality. I mean, I can tell you for people in technology and AI, you know, these kinds of explanations are very difficult to understand. But I do think that they give us keys to rethink AI so that we get into tools, better tools, or other tools. And in particular, we get to systems that maybe deal with some of the really big issues in terms of ethics and you know, that are currently coming up with AI. So so now let me start and by introducing actually work by Daniel Kahneman, which I'm sure all of you know. And well, this is a translation, French translation of the book. In English, it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. But I kind of like this this French translation because they talk about the two systems that Kahneman introduces. System one, which we can call the cognitive mind, and system two, which we can call the sapient mind. Now, system one, it's a sort of mode of the mind, if you want, is fast, reactive. I mean, in the sense of immediately giving answers to a question, to a problem. It is based on experience, and it is learned by training, by seeing many examples, by data, in fact. So this is like the data-driven AI that is exemplified by ChatGPT and other systems. But then Kahneman makes it very clear that there's also this system two, which happens when we more slowly and in a deliberative way think about the problem and construct a rich model with inferences and reasoning in order to come up with a decision. And the way we learn these things is very different from the way the cognitive mind is learning. It's not by training from massive amounts of data, it's through abstraction for sure, but also through construction. That means by creating frameworks and applying them to the world. And earlier, I think Molly contrasted enacted versus extracted. And this is indeed the distinction. This is a play here where extracted is really, in this terminology, what system one is doing. And the construction of frameworks and by interacting with the world is the thing that system two is doing. Okay, so if we map this out now, then you know, we already have two regions, as Francisco called it, or two modes, or you know, we can have many different terms. One is the cognitive mind, and the other one is the sapient mind. And the cognitive mind, one way to make the distinction is in terms of the stance you need to describe or to interact with this kind of mind. And for a cognitive mind, we expect goals and sub-goals. So it's a sort of teleological stance, which we apply, for example, when we see an animal collecting food, or when we see somebody, you know, building something. We think that this person has goals and etc. Now, in the case of the sapient mind, we have to adopt what Dennett has called the intentional stance, which is, you know, to assume that that person has beliefs, intentions, desires, motivations, and is also, in a sense, goal-directed, of course, but is also, you know, using this intentional stance, actually. We need to use it to really understand the problem. There's also this concept of the knowledge level sense that Alan Yu will introduce, which is the idea that we assume that that person knows certain things and is using that knowledge to make decisions. So this is two. And another way to make a distinction between the two is in terms of the medium that is used to let's say, implement the processes happening in each of these minds. And so for the cognitive mind, this is electricity, basically, as in a neural network, propagation of signals in a network. But for the sapient mind, it is symbolic. And a symbol here in the sense of a word, for example, like language, which has both a form, a sign, but also a signifier, what this symbol is about, and a particular definition for getting to the signifier. Okay, so this is already two regions, if you want, and they correspond to regions that Francisco talked about in this paper. But then there's another region, which is the embodiment. This is the bodily mind. And well, I say bodily mind because it is really the body. You sometimes say the body has a mind of its own, right? But it's not completely controllable because the body has physics, has biology, which is happening independent. I mean, if you fall from a balcony, your body becomes a physical object, and you can think what you want and scream and so on, but you just are undergoing the laws of physics. Or if you are recovering in the hospital from a cancer treatment, I mean, you are reduced to a biological system, and that's the main thing dominating at that point, what you can do and who you are. And the body, has ways to learn, you could say. One is also by training, like your muscles that you exercise. But there's also things that the body has, which we call in our field emergent functionality, which is that some movement has a side effect, which has a positive effect, which it has then to be captured and reused later if that particular side effect is called for. And so we can add to this picture now another region or another mode, which is the bodily mind. And here to describe the bodily mind, we need a biophysical stance. We have to view the organism as a physical object or a biological object. Okay. Now then there's sentience, and the word sentience again has many meanings, and like sapiens and like cognition, so it's difficult to talk. But one use of the word certainly is that it is about the regulation of growth, defense, motivation system. It's hormonal. It is not working through the nervous system, although it's very connected to the nervous system. It diffuses in tissue, even if there's no network. And of course, in plants or in animals without a nervous system, this particular sentient system is very important. So that also deserves a particular place. This is not one of the regions that is in the Varela paper, but I think it deserves to be. And the stance that you need in order to understand an organism, in terms of a sentient mind, is an affective stance. So it's about emotions and about the impact it has. And of course, the sentient mind has impact on the body and the cognitive mind. I mean, you cannot really split those things, that they all come together, they all interact, resonate with each other. Now, the medium for the sentient system is really hormonal, chemical. And so the cognitive we can easily, well, easily, I mean, we can hope to simulate in or emulate in the artificial systems like computers or other kinds of hardware that also use electricity. But the sentient, I mean, we would need a chemical machine that and we have to work on diffusion and all of these things to really get to that level, into that medium, and nobody really is doing that. Okay, and then finally, there is also this feature that of reflection, as it is called, which is that you may have base level entities and processes, for example, symbolic entities, symbolic processes, which then are occurring, but then there's a meta level in which for these entities, there are other entities at the meta level so that the processing can happen and then again have an influence at the base level. This sounds a little bit abstract, but you know, you would be surprised that in your mobile phone or in a computer, there are reflective systems inside. For example, if a program is running and gets into an error state, I mean, your device does not break down completely. There's another process at the meta level that will catch the error and try to do something about it, and certainly prevent that is a total breakdown. And then maybe it can be repaired and then go back to the base level. And so there's a lot to say about reflection, but this is certainly another thing that is happening, or that is part of the multiplicity of minds, which is the conscious mind, where in order to understand, in order to predict how somebody behaves, that you assume that there's this meta level is present and there's reasoning going on, or reasoning or processing at the level above. Okay, so we end up with this picture of 5 modes or 5 regions. And then you can ask, well, where is the I in all this? And well, the I, like in I fell from the stairs, I feel pain, I recognize my mother in this picture, I understand your argument, I will believe it when I see it again because I do not remember this. I mean, so there's always I. And clearly the I is a different thing, right? And so we could say that the I is a kind of system, you could say a way of being, which has an identity of its own. And again, in the spirit of Maturana, Varela, and people in this whole Thompson and so on, you know, that this is the concept that I think all of you know of autopoiesis, which is really that you have a system which generates itself actively. And so it becomes, it has agency, and it distinguishes itself from its environment by carving out a particular pattern of interaction. It has the border, but also a pattern of interaction with the environment, but also, and very importantly, with other beings in that environment, but the interaction happens at that particular level. And so the system maintains itself by renewing itself, and also it makes its own laws, its own autonomous. And so the idea which I think Francisco expressed in this paper is that actually for all of these 5 minds that I talked about, there is actually a kind of self, which is an autopoietic system that has all the properties that I just mentioned. I mean, the prototype case of autopoiesis is the cell, right? But the same properties hold actually for each of these, let's say, each of these selves. And so they each have a mind, but they each have interfaces, they each have ways in which they can build themselves up, and can maintain themselves, they defend themselves. And so for the cognitive self, for example, these are all the mechanisms that we know about in which the cognitive mind can build up itself by learning, by training, by weights in these networks and things like that. But the same is true for the sentient self or the sapient self. They should be viewed as autonomous, autopoietic systems. And then, of course, they all work together, interact with each other, influence each other. So you get this idea of meshwork. And so indeed, if we talk about the I, it depends which self that we are talking about, right? The bodily self, if you fall from the stairs, the sentient self, I feel pain. Cognitive self, I recognize my mother, sapient self. I understand your argument, reflective cells. I will believe it when I see it. So, so we get really this idea of the multiplicity, and I'm sure by now, at least some of you, maybe everybody, is beginning to think about this idea of the 5 aggregates. And, I'm just adding the different names to it. Well, they're translated here, and of course, translation in English is always a weak reflection of the rich meanings of these particular terms. But so I think this is where we can get enormous inspiration from Buddhist thought, who have been thinking in terms of these modes of mind, you could say, or this multiplicity of mind. And there's intriguingly also this non-self anatta. I will not talk about it, certainly not for this audience, which is much more competent in these matters. But there is this thing, of course, that the mind can switch between, or the organism, where one of these modes of minds, regions of minds is dominant, right? And I mean, and so you can shift all these things, or you can also try to release all these things and actually not have one of these as dominant. Okay, so this was the first thing. I'm quickly looking at the clock here. I still have 15 minutes. Well, I don't hear anything, so I suppose the answer is yes. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So this was the first idea. Now the second idea, and there are many more, but I just picked out because of time limitations, is the idea of enactivism. And oh, sorry. There are better ways to do this, but okay. And so this is another set of, I think, very powerful ideas, which are very different from the way that current machine learning AI works. The way current machine learning works is by collecting data, doing statistical induction with, whatever probabilistic networks or deep learning or other kinds of learning. And then you get a model and you apply this model then to particular cases. Now, in the case of enactivism, I mean, we are talking about, well, maybe I should show you a little clip of Francisco himself explaining what enactivism is. This was recorded. This is one of the conversations I had with him in Brussels.
Luke, I'm not hearing the sound on that.
Well, let's see, how can we do this? I will try again.
Looking for information outside to be represented inside.
Can you hear?
What you see, what you look for is principles for how an active engagement and an active handling, an active history of a situated agent actually makes meaning and makes information come up, arise, be shaped, be formed. Okay? Which is why I like to call this way of looking at things the enactive view of cognitive science. Enactive, the word inaction in English is interesting because it connotes both action and shaping something, bringing forth something. So it's like you enact a play. So as you see, the fundamental metaphor, instead of being one of outside or inside, is actually one of walking and laying down a path in walking. As the famous poem from Antonio Machado says, there is no path, you lay down a path in walking. Is that instead of...
Sorry. So, so this is the idea, right? That the data is not there, actually. Also, the frameworks for categorizing the data are not given, but it is by interactions with the world and by you know, and with others in the world, that basically the path is being formed. And of course, if part of the path is formed, if there are categories, then new data become relevant, new meanings become apparent. And so the thing is that, you know, with my group, I've been working for quite a while, actually, how to translate these ideas into concrete AI experiments. And so they took the form of, well, first of all, we work with real physical robots, because if you talk about embodiment, well, then you need physical robots. You cannot just, you know, even make simulations, because reality is going to create situations that you could not foresee or you could not model. And in our experiments, the robots basically interact with each other and they play language games. And so, and this example here is language games where they ask each other to do certain actions, but they start out without the categories, without the words, but through their interactions, they build up the path, if you want, you know, like through walking. They introduce categories, they introduce words, they negotiate how they're going to talk about the world and how they're going to categorize the world. And in the interest of, I don't have much of time to go in detail, but I'm just going to focus on experiments where we do this to get a bodily self, which is really made up of a whole collection of inputs and of internal models, you could say, a motor image, a visual image. You know, there are motor streams. This is a concrete example of a robot moving the arms. And this is the proprioception, actually, in the motors of the robot. This is part of the visual prototype. So there's a whole system that has all the different functions that you would need to play these language games, including a network, which is initially empty, that is linking sensory experiences with visual prototypes of postures, motor behaviors, words to talk about them. And so, you know, this. So the experiments, typically we let the robot first play with itself, if I may use that word. That means to move the body and to, which is a bit less, okay. And so you see what the robot is seeing. You also see on the right-hand side is actually an internal model that's being built as the robot is exploring its own body. And then here's another example of this. This is the robot standing before a mirror looking at itself. And this is for building up these relationships between visual perception and motor action, in order also to be able to see later, when looking at somebody, whether the gesture or the posture that the speaker was asking for is actually constructed by the hearer. Now we do this with several, and so each of them has this bodily, models, all these models connected, this bodily self, which is dynamically being constructed. And this is an example of, you see here the number of interactions at the bottom here. Each of these interactions is a language game. And this is part of the dynamics of the words linked to prototypes and so on. So I cannot, it's just a little taste of the kind of experiments that we have been doing. And I think in order to have a little bit of time for discussion, I think I should stop here, just stop with a little extra video where maybe this is sort of an experiment in well, in the bodily self, but also in, learning what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and maybe we can go to the question session. I cannot. Oops. I don't know.
We can't hear you, John.
Okay, yeah. We cannot hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you very much, Luke. So you didn't hear the applause, but I assure you, I assure you. And I know Evan and Kristen are online as well, I think. So if you want to, just pop on, turn on your video, and if you have any comments. But love to hear some comments from our panelists. We don't have time, unfortunately. We're going to try to break at 12:30. So any thoughts, reactions? And if there's time, we'll even take questions from the audience. But anyone have a thought of it? Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Luke. That was really, really interesting. And I was very struck by your observation about the existence of monocultures within the AI field itself, and also your observation that the dominant approach of AI currently has as its legacy the behaviorist tradition in psychology. Right? So I think that those two things are connected, and I want to hear more thoughts, if you have any, about ways to disrupt or kind of perturb that monoculture. And in particular, when I look at the history of psychology, when I look at Watson's 1913 paper, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, which was really trying to make psychology into a real science, and in doing so, throwing out all subjectivity from the study of human beings, right? Is there a parallel in the AI field where subjectivity and experience are really like cast aside in favor of those cognitive functions that are more readily encoded in algorithms? And like, what do we do about that?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. There's a very clear parallel, actually, also historically. If you look at, let's say, the early 50s, that the beginning of neural networks, people like Rosenblatt, and the first, like Minsky also, who built the first associative networks, were very much influenced by behaviorists. In fact, Minsky was at Harvard, very close to the behaviors groups that were there, Skinner in particular. And so there was big fights in AI, very similar to what happened in psychology, with people like Seymour Papert and then Minsky, who kind of converted to more cognitive views, well, cognitive in the sense of taking, influenced by Piaget, by Brunner, and so on. And but just like in, let's say, in psychology itself, I mean, the behaviorism came back through the back door of neuroscience, actually, right? And suppressing the thoughts on subjectivity and accepting personal accounts and of course Francisco Varela was one of the people fighting against that. And this paper on the enchantment of the concrete is actually about that also. And he also argued against the sort of rational Cartesian view, which is another trend, actually, a thread in AI research. But but I think that it is possible to build a new kind of AI using an active foundation. And well, how to do that? You need money, you need labs, you need people that are convinced, right? But at the moment, it's like the bananas in the monoculture. It's all about the next percentage extra on optimizing a particular, um, parameter in test data and things like that. So I think we just have to let this wave pass, and then we can again build up, yeah, the alternative.
What I'm just really curious, and it's a little invasive of me to ask, but just in a kind of mind play, what an inactive AI look like?
Well, for one thing, it would not start with the idea that you need to have all these data, because the data has to be built up by the system in interaction with the environment, so this is already one thing. The second thing is also that the key issue is relevance or meaning, if you want. So we have to think about the AI system as something that has a purpose in a particular functional setting. But now, I mean, ChatGPT does not have these kinds of things. It's doing statistical analysis and then spitting out back the patterns. But these patterns, as Evan was saying, they are statistical generalizations. But a statistical generalization is not the same thing as a meaningful distinction. It's something that's recurrent, but it's not for that purpose. And we see that even in computer vision, like why don't we have self-driving cars? Well, part of it is because the recognition of traffic signs, it does not work because the features that are coming out of the statistical induction are not the features that we find important and relevant to the traffic sign. So I think this goes quite deep, actually. It's not just a little variant, but it's to get more robustness, relevance, adaptability, etc. But this is there's more to say, but this is a first quick.
Can I jump in?
Yes, go ahead, Richie.
I loved your presentation, Luke, and I particularly appreciate the vision of creating a new kind of AI that learns through the inactive processes. My question really is about the extent to which the vision really is so beyond what we can possibly envision, at least in the near future. And so you talk about why we can't have self-driving cars and the problems inherent in that issue. We have 200 million neurons in our gut that are continuously monitoring our internal environment. There are countless mechanisms inside the body that we haven't even described or characterized yet that are associated with interoceptive processes that give rise to the kind of experience that Molly had with His Holiness. We are so far away from developing sensors of these systems that would be critical for a true AI that would actually really be an enactive AI. And so I wonder how you and your colleagues think about that when you are attempting to create these enactive AIs.
Well, you're absolutely right. The complexity of the sentient system and the interaction with the body, speaking at the human, is extraordinarily complex, and at the moment totally beyond our our way of measuring or sensing or our way of modeling it. But we don't need to look, well, intelligence is broader here than human intelligence. This is also a theme, I think, of the gathering, the more than human, right? I mean, the octopus, for example, is an extraordinary organism with very little nervous system, actually. In other words, there's very little at the sapient, well, probably nothing at the sapient level. There is cognition, certainly, but a lot is happening at the sentient and the other. So I think the goal of AI, well, I think it never was to build something that is totally like a human being. I mean, that would be impossible. But we can study systems and learn more, in terms of the science of the mind, by looking at simpler organisms, which are still extraordinarily complicated, but so that these other aspects, like the emotional level that you mentioned earlier, can be studied in simpler systems, before we make this big jump.
Other comments from our panelists? Yes, I will. Unless Evan wants to say something, but I don't see him right now. Or Chris.
I can say something quick, just
Yeah,
on the,
jump in. Yeah.
on the point that was just addressed. I think that so here it's important also to think about the history of AI. The kinds of deep learning networks that we're familiar with really represent, as Luke was talking, one trajectory that came out of neural network research, whereas a very different style of research, for example, is Steve Grossberg's work, where you have neural networks that are not supervised, that have to generate their own perceptual categories and bring forth in a very enactive style their own world. So the question for me, really the core question is, if you take that kind of neural network research and you embed it in robotics work, where the idea is to create autonomous agents via autonomous sensory motor loops, this is really a question about sensory motor autonomy in relationship to autopoiesis. In the biological body, the way all of that happens is through rhythmic metabolic entities, neurons that are embedded in glial cells in a hormone system and an endocrine system with affect and life regulation. So the question is, and this is going to actually be something I raise in my talk, is whether in AI and robotics you could actually achieve something like sensory motor autonomy bypassing the metabolic affective life regulation. And I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think that Francisco was actually, I think, ambivalent. I talked to Francisco about this, on certain occasions. I think he was he was unsure about that. So there's a style of research where I actually am in some ways more worried about this kind of AI research in the long run, is if it were to follow enactive principles and you were to create autonomous sensory motor agents and a very robust sense of autonomy, would that actually require affect and motivation, as I'm inclined to think it would? And hence, would these be sentient beings? And then that's when you create sentience, you create suffering. And that's a very, very complicated situation that's very different from anything that we're currently facing. I think a lot of people, inflate the current technologies to think that that's the situation we're in. And I don't think we're in that situation at all right now. But if you were to follow an active AI, I actually think you might achieve that. And then we would have some very serious questions to be considering. So there's sort of two things, just to summarize. One is, can you achieve the sensory motor autonomy bypassing the affective life regulation, things that you get from living cells? Maybe, but I'm inclined to think not. And then if you were to actually achieve it and it would entail sentience, then you've also created suffering and the possibility of suffering, and you've created communal beings within, with whom you have to participate in a shared life. And that's something we're completely unprepared for, I think.
Yeah, if I may comment on that. Well, I think
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, Luke. Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I was going to say we have to take if the different modes that I talked about. So there's the cognitive mode, the embodiment. Okay, if you take those two, then we're talking about a robot that is maybe able to autonomously interact with the environment, build up its categories and things like that, right? Okay, but then we should not forget the other aspects. And one of them is the affective. The other one is also the sapient and the conscious level. So if we create more and more complex minds, then you need more and more of this extra complexity, let's say. And so I think for the effective to directly say we could make, I think, simple systems that can do without this affective layer or mode, and also without the sapient and a conscious. But if it becomes more complex, then we would need it. Well, I mean, we would need it. It appears in nature that you see systems that have additional levels of mind, let's say, in evolution. Now, whether then the issue of suffering, I don't know. Yeah, that's a very big issue you're raising here. I have to think about it.
Yes, we all do. We leave alone some kind of new sentient life form. We have trouble dealing with ourselves and the rest of our species on the planet. But I'll just say that we have just a few minutes, but maybe we could see, starting here in the room, if there are any burning question that someone would like to raise about this talk or also about Bali's talk. Anyone have a, yes, Axel?
Consciousness, if there is an enactment consciousness, does it create karma? Maybe that goes to the point of suffering, because if it's not creating karma, then it's not possibly creating suffering. And is it part of our lived wisdom, understanding and dealing with our karma? And is that something that a machine could ever do?
Like once you get to a certain kind of point, if this sense of autonomy is the kind of very robust autonomy that involves affect and especially motivations and intentions, then on the classic definition of karma, which is karma is cetana, which means karma is actually a metaphor So it's where the result of something is used to name that thing. So it's like holding up an apple seed and saying, here's an apple tree. So karma is actually the result of intentions. So if, these kinds of entities have intentions in that sense, then they have karma. Whether they could deal with their karma, I don't know. Most of us can't anyway. So that's a good question, but that would be the classic Buddhist, technical Buddhist answer.
I think one of the problems here is about agency, about trying to generate agency in these kinds of systems. And so like the talk I gave last year about trying to understand even biologically when agency occurs, agency and autonomy. Because we have no machine. We're not even clear how this happens for a cell, and so then embodying it in a machine, because it involves causal closure. It's again autopoiesis. The system creates the processes and products, which create the processes and products, which create the processes and products. So that fundamental question of agency, how to create something that is agentic, I think is such an open question. We don't understand it for life, so I don't think we're going to come close to understanding it for machines.
And actually, there's a very complicated relationship between intention and agency. It's not just an equivalence. So I saw Chris had his hand up. Can we run it?
So I'm really enjoying this morning, and I'm feeling, I might be not the only person feeling a little bit heartbroken by some of it. And I think my deep to a kind of critical at school type question, like, why are we doing this? Like, in whose interest is the kind of knowledge that we're generating here? And I'm thinking particularly about Molly's paper. I work in a university too, and I have lots of students who hand in papers written by ChatGPT. Usually because they're really stressed, right? They work in a system that gives them incredible deadlines and do it. They can't get their credentials. And the purpose of that system is to pay for their credential and get it. They write their paper with ChatGPT, and then I sit there and go, shall I get ChatGPT to mark this? And then, it's not an impossible outcome, right? And then we've kind of radically dehumanized what it means to be involved in education and to generate knowledge. And then I think, what does the Buddha say knowledge is for? And it's to alleviate suffering. And that's not alleviating suffering, that's making money.
The term that I use, the term that I used last night, Chris, to describe, why, is a weird term. It's hedonic curiosity. It comes out of, barely post-adolescent, et cetera, I don't have to add all the adjectives, that we understand who. And it is, the intention is not the intention that we have, let's say, in our Buddhist context, which is to alleviate suffering. It is actually rather the opposite. It's a sort of hedonic intention.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. And it really was at the front of our minds as we were writing the paper, right? Like, you wouldn't have so much enthusiasm for AI if not for the demands of productivity that our institutions put on all of us. And so for that reason, I think I'm really encouraged to see young people thinking about labor organizing much more than when I was in college, and thinking about systems of power and exploitation, because ultimately it does come back to that. And I think, there's this really unfortunate interplay between, there's the hedonic curiosity, absolutely, but also like, who gave them the keys to the car, right? Like why do they have the keys to the car that we're all in? Yeah, I think that if there is a silver lining, it's that all of these dynamics were already here before this moment of AI. Education was already being heavily tilted towards the quantitative, the extractive, and not meaning making, not understanding. And what is, I think, useful about this moment of AI, really confronting what we're doing in higher education is like, it forces us to reckon with like, what is the point of this? Like, why are we doing that? Are we educating our students to be able to write mediocre essays? Like, I don't think that's why any of us got into education. And so like, it is helpful in that sense.
Buying credentials. It's a business. We're selling credentials and they're buying them. It's really exactly like, is that what it's all? Is that why we went into this? Nah, I hope not. But it certainly feels that way sometimes. As a former department chair, I can tell you. So actually, I think Roshi, shall we break now? And we're going to head directly to lunch. It's been a really wonderful morning. Thank you so much to our online folks. Thank you for spending the time. Wonderful talks from Molly and from Luke. And we'll hear more this afternoon. So have a good lunch, a good break until 2:30. Yes? Have a good break until 2:30. Maybe move the body a little. Take a nice walk. There's beautiful places to walk around here. Remember to drink your water. Cool. And we'll see you soon.